these things have been, killing and injuring people for years, and you would think that in the 100 years that we've had to kind of do medical studies into tear gas, that this would be a little bit better known and more talked about. But NATO, who's largely responsible for the kind of surge in non-lethal weapons that happened in the 1990s, in a 2006 report, concluded that really we don't know anything about the reality of these weapons in their real-time use. So I'm going to kind of talk about how I ended up making media maps and Riot IDs. So this is a bit of a mashup of some theoretical work I've been doing with some methodology, with some practice. And it's the first time that I've kind of mashed them together. So we will see how this goes. It's a bit of an experiment. So I'm going to start off by kind of giving a bit of context on how I got to be working with these things, and then I'll go into a little bit of theory, and then I'll talk about media maps and Riot IDs, as the title suggests. I'm going to be quite honest, not just because I'm American, but because I think it's really important, especially when we're dealing with things like data and the digital, to be really honest about the fact that often we don't know what we're doing, and that this stuff is really new, and that often we kind of stumble into these methodologies. So it's not going to be presented so much as like a funding bid as like what actually kind of happened. So there's two sort of major questions that are guiding this work for me. And the first is thinking about how media and communication studies can help us better understand what I've referred to as other media objects. And in other work that I've done, that's looking at things like tents and protest camps, looking at, I've got a paper on fences and thinking about fences as information communication technologies. And I'm kind of really interested in that because I feel that often we either stick with traditional and now social media, and that's what we treat as media in our discipline, or we talk about kind of evil media, and that's like the dark side of surveillance and data, but rarely do we think about other kinds of objects that are very present in communication processes and very present in other kinds of communication dynamics. And so I'm interested in thinking about how these other kinds of objects may in fact be media and communication objects, or at least have a lot to gain from the insight that media and communication studies can bring to them. And the second set of questions that a lot of my work has been thinking about, and more kind of practice-based here, is these issues that are kind of arising in data visualization and data-driven journalism around how we aggregate information, particularly when that information is on sensitive subjects and when that information is kept hidden from us. And so some of the practical things I'll be talking about are about addressing this kind of invisible data, making data visible, bringing it into knowability. So my work is informed most heavily probably by science and technology studies, particularly new materialisms and histories of media technologies, as well as very much by queer theory and particularly queer epistemologies and queer phenomenologies. And so that's all kind of in the background, but I'm not going to spend too much time kind of engaging directly with that. But if anyone has questions on the more kind of theoretical stuff, feel free to ask it. So for me, thinking about tear gas, which is largely what I'm going to talk about today, came through the work that we had been doing for our book on protest camps, which charts the last kind of mostly 50 years of protest camps, but beginning in the 1930s with the Bonus Army encampment in 1932. And we also spend a lot of time talking about Resurrection City, which is a camp that Martin Luther King is the last kind of thing he designed before he was killed. And then, of course, we were writing amidst the Occupy movement and the Arab uprisings. And I started to notice when I was going through the photos of these movements that there was something that ran across them, a thread that had to do with how they were handled by the police. And of course, that thread was tear gas. And this struck me because I didn't realize that tear gas existed in 1932. And that was, I was like, what, like, where did this come from? Like, this is actually kind of a strange thing. Like, how is it that we can use a chemical weapon on people? And so I was doing a postdoc at the time, and it was probably like 2 a.m. because I had no schedule. And I was like, let's just Google. Like, let's just see where tear gas comes from. And so 3 years in a book contract and a lot of hours later, I am still trying to answer this question and of, how did we get here? How did this happen? And so in the process of trying to answer this question, I've been working with lots and lots of people and lots of organizations, and everything that I'm going to kind of talk about from here on in is part of a collaborative project, sometimes collaborative with one person and sometimes collaborative with many people, but none of this is me individually in my magic brain or anything. And we've also had some small grants, just again in the kind of hyper honesty mode. This has been done with a bunch of piecemeal small grants. We've never had more than kind of 15 grand is the biggest one we've had, and we're usually working on kind of 5 grand budgets. And so it's also been a very kind of activist-oriented DIY project in how you piece funding together to be able to do collaborative projects from the institution, especially when they're on, somewhat contentious topics. So what happens when you Google tear gas? Well, the first thing that happens is that you discover that tear gas is in fact not a gas at all, and this will become important later. It's a chemical that gets mixed in with kind of a smoke, and that's what gives it this kind of smoky feeling, and there's also sprays, and they can be launched in all kinds of ways. And then if you Google a little bit more, you'll find out that the kind of first sort of major time that tear gas gets produced is during the First World War, and that it's after the First World War that this very entrepreneurial general decides that we should try and create a mass commercial market for law enforcement to sell tear gas. And then if you dig around a little bit more, you start to find some very interesting documents about why tear gas was going to be used for law enforcement. So for example, with the rise in kind of crowd psychology, which was coming over from France at the turn of the century, at the end of the 1800s, was this idea that the mob had to be dispersed and had to be destroyed. And tear gas was seen as this really great way to disperse the mob. And importantly, here, there was also a complete consciousness and awareness that using tear gas made protesters look silly, and that you could win the media game, you could win the PR battle by using the tear gas and making the protesters have to run away. And this you can kind of trace back over this kind of 100 years of how this works. And of course, today this would be kind of more likely be denied, but it's very, very clear in these early documents about why it was being sold. And I think most importantly from a kind of medical humanitarian perspective, for the entire last 100 years that tear gas has been used, it's been marketed as causing no permanent injuries. And of course, in reality, tear gas is what's called less lethal, which means it's less likely to kill you than if I shoot you in the face, but it is not non-lethal. So it is very possible for people to be killed. And this is probably the only disturbing image, but there will be some other disturbing images in the presentation, which is always a warning that I should give at the beginning and always forget until I get to this slide. So it causes a searing sensation in the eyes, which is this is a kind of image that we often see in the media, but it also can cause permanent eye damage because of this. It causes all kinds of vomiting and choking, and then in severe cases, this can cause asphyxiation, particularly if you are a small person or an elderly person or anyone with any kind of like pre-existing medical condition. It's been linked to reproductive problems as well as miscarriages, and one of the things that people often die from is when they're actually struck with a grenade or a canister itself. So all of these things have been killing and injuring people for years, and you would think that in the 100 years that we've had to kind of do medical studies into tear gas that this would be a little bit better known and more talked about. But NATO, who's largely responsible for the kind of surge in non-lethal weapons that happened in the 1990s, in a 2006 report concluded that really we don't know anything about the reality of these weapons in their real-time use. So not just in clinical trials that we've done, many of which the clinical trials are archived here at the University of Sussex, that were done in Porton-Down, but that we don't actually kind of have definitive knowledge. And so this is the state that we are in today. So we have no formal record keeping or statistics available on injuries and deaths from tear gas. Those statistics do not exist at any kind of level, regionally, locally, nationally, internationally. None of those levels is there a record of this. There's no standardization of what's called use of force monitoring. So this is for anyone who's following, say, the police killings in the US and the Black Lives Matter movement. One of the big projects there of the Counted is kind of trying to make a record where there is no record of police killings. And so the same is true for less lethal weapons. There's no standardized or legally required monitoring of any of the times that police use force. And there's all this kind of new research coming out that's being done on quite a small scale that's pointing to these kinds of problems and calling for more research in the medical community. So this is just to give some context of where we are at. And so when we kind of think about the last 100 years, we find that tear gas remains as effective today at demoralizing and dispersing crowds as it was a century ago. Turning the street from a place of protest into toxic chaos, it clogs the air, the one communication channel that even the most powerless can use to voice their grievances. And for me, it's here, in thinking about this communication aspect of tear gas, that I want to spend a moment on theory and saying why I think it's important that we take tear gas, which at first thought probably we don't consider a media technology or having anything to do with communication studies, and we think, like, what's this woman doing, what's she talking about? And then when we think about it, it actually becomes something that I think is integral to the very premise and the very basic ways in which we think about communication. So anyone who's taken a kind of media comms intro class will be familiar with this lovely diagram of our encoder and our decoder, and we send the message, and the message goes through the channel, and sometimes there's noise. So I want to know what happens. What happens when there's tear gas? Is tear gas the noise? Is tear gas a communication channel? Is it a medium? And if it's a medium, is it the message? And so, how do we make sense of this fact that we have political communication happening in a toxic environment, right? So what does that mean? How do we understand that as a media and communications scholar? So one of the things that we've been using, and this is work I do with Anya Kangisa, is looking at what in geography, she's a geographer, is talked about in terms of elemental geography and atmospherics. And with there's a new book just out on elemental media, so we're starting to see the kind of this literature across disciplines here, and thinking about air as something that gets lost. This atmospheric gets lost in what we talk about because of the fact that we can't really see it. And so it's hard to give it meaning or to understand what it is. And of course, in music studies, there's also been some really interesting work on the atmospheric of fandom and emotionality, even linking back to kind of Grossberg and Williams and this kind of idea of the affective atmospheres. And so they're also we have a little bit of a trajectory of this in kind of media studies as well. And so in the work that we've been doing, so Anya works on sound and I work on gas, is to think about how part of this problem is semiotic. That because we don't have an easily available system for rendering this kind of toxic atmospheric into a kind of visual presence, except for in this image that we so often see of the cloud. But the cloud doesn't actually make us understand what this is or what it does. And often when the cloud is captured, it's captured in these shots of the usually young man, often brown, throwing a tear gas canister back towards a police line, or at least assumed to be back towards a police line, but often just out of the way of other people. And this happens because, in photojournalistic terms, we have a lovely hero, we have a singular figure, which is great for narrative, and that makes a lot of sense. Also, this happens in toxicology for reasons of toxicology, which is that the only time that you have this really thick cloud is at that moment of release, and the only way to catch that moment of release is to catch someone in that moment of the shot. So the kind of journalistic values and the toxicology kind of come together to produce this really common image. But this image is part of the problem in terms of knowability, because we are seeing something that is actually just more part of this kind of reproduction of the myth. So this leads to two research problems. The first I'm kind of thinking about as an object-oriented research problem, which is this idea, this kind of more theoretical idea about how do we understand what this thing is, and that we have this lack of understanding about it as well as where it came from. And I mean object-oriented not just in the kind of ontological sense, but also just in the empirical sense of what we actually know, what information is actually available. And then a data deficiency, so that we have a lack of available information on health effects, use of force, trade, and legal recognition. So how do we fill this data deficiency for an object which is very difficult to understand and know? So, media maps and Riot IDs. So the first way that I kind of went about trying to figure this out, more so the second problem than the first problem, was I thought, hey, these media stories are really ephemeral. You read it, and then it kind of goes away and goes in the news, and we have no idea how much this stuff is used, and we have no idea, like, even where. And so I thought, well, what if we just, every time there's a media story, I stick it on a map? And like I thought of this because I had just been to like a hen party and made the Bachelorette like a map and of where we were going to go on Google Maps. And so I had like Google Maps in my head, and I was like, oh, we could use Google Maps. So I had no idea what I was doing, and I did this in a very, very like absolutely not the way. Like if there's any geographers in the room, like you would be like in tears if after I tell you like this is 100% not how to do this. I will show you how to do it later. So I set up a Google alert. That part's fine. It's limited because it's only in English and it's only for a single keyword. And that Google report would then give me stories. I would take the first story from a reliable source. I would click on the link, read the story, put the story summary wherever it mentioned tear gas and the location into my Google map box, and it would create a pin for me, and then it would be on the map. And then if you go onto the pin, you get the little story and his thing. And because it's Google Maps, you can then, you don't have to be too savvy to figure out how to convert the file so that you can then download it as a spreadsheet and you can do other kinds of things with it. And thankfully, these nice pretty maps, we'll look at some of them close up. A graduate student, I think he was only a BA student at the time, Matt Ellis saved me and geocoded all of these for me and like made me proper maps, which was fantastic. But media mapping in general is I think, it became very useful, and I'll look at each of these things in detail, because it allowed for this kind of quick identification of trends, rather than for anyone who does kind of quant analysis or content analysis, often it's quite difficult, right, to look at it and see what's happening. You have to go through the analysis and the visualization. You don't get the visual analysis immediately. So it's very useful, geocoding and mapping, very useful for this kind of instant ability to be able to see what's happening with your data. Really useful as an interface for archiving stories, creates a strong visual impact, and adaptability, and the stuff around data adaptability. So I'll talk about what I mean by all of these things. So it becomes very easy to identify trends. You can, using very basic things, even just like CartoDB, you'd be using a Google Sheet, and you can have it automatically update onto your map. So you can be keeping a constant visual record of what's happening in the media, and all of this can be automated. Probably your new digital humanities labs people can show you how to do any of this. And so some of the things that became really interesting here is that we realized very quickly that East Africa was a huge user of tear gas, and very, very little was known about that region and its use. And it also, like this is Brazil, this is pre-World Cup, so we've got lots of use in Brazil. And so you can also kind of start to see things that are happening more broadly in the world around protests and social justice, and the use of tear gas, which was quite useful then for staying on top of the news and kind of trying to get the research that we were doing out there for journalists and for stories. And so because you're archiving the news stories, all you have to then do is search for Brazil, and you get all of these records of police uses on Brazil. And so we use that to package for a couple stories that we ran around the protests in Brazil. And so there's this really nice way that it becomes an archive for you as well as a usable archive for journalists. It created a lot of visual impact and this kind of adaptability. So because it was a map and people like maps, and because it was the data could be reused because all the data was open, we found it kind of moved in really interesting directions that probably if we had just written a research report would not have moved. And certainly if we had just written an article in a academic journal, it would not have gone anywhere. And so it went into an Amnesty report, it went onto a bunch of blogs, got reused by students at different universities, and then the media was very friendly towards it. And so we got quite good media coverage for it. And if we look at the research that's coming out now on the sort of emergent area of data storytelling, which is what we're quite interested in, which we're kind of defining as where a sort of narrative meets data visualization, this also makes sense. So the kind of primary trends that are what make data visualization, data storytelling successful is that they have a comprehension, they're comprehensible, and that's using a lot of theory coming out of information design and user experience, that they invoke curiosity. And there, a lot of that work is coming out of the kind of serious games folks and thinking about this kind of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and why it is that we want to engage with the visualization and what pulls us into it. And then relatability, so our ability to relate to what is in the visualization. For visualizations with people, for example, anytime that you can put an actual figure and not just like an icon, like a more humanized figure, that will increase the relatability of your visualization. So there's lots of kind of engineering people types doing lots of these kinds of studies into what works around these things. This, for example, our map has what's called a drill down story visualization. So you can zoom into it and click into it and get that kind of localized knowledge. And so that invokes curiosity because you want to know who's been tear gassed in my local neighborhood, as we saw in a story that came out a couple weeks ago at African Arguments, or just last week, in fact, about the elections there, which have seen lots and lots and lots of tear gassing. Uganda is one of the leading tear gassers, and so the journalist, he's actually a grad student at UEA, took the research and took the data and said that that Uganda was the sixth, ranked a proud 6th worldwide and the largest user of tear gas in sub-Sahara Africa, which is a nice little kind of information tidbit. And in the context here, this made sense. But then something happened. People started tweeting just this little teeny bit of information. And then the part of us that's like, I'm a rigorous and serious researcher, gets like really nervous because you're like, this is actually completely false. And like not really the way to understand and read this data because it's obviously incomplete. It's an aggregation. It's not a totalizing thing. So it has all of these absences, which we talk about if you go on to the actual research and you see the actual write-up about all the limitations in the data, which we do have on the map itself. It's not like you have to go and read an academic article to find it. But of course, it's going to be lost in these kinds of, as we continually kind of remediate. And this process of this kind of layering and circling and distorting that happens is something that with our BU research data labs team at Bournemouth, we've been thinking about with the metaphor of a layer cake. We're not sure how well this works, but this is where we got. This is our visualization of visualizations. And so you have a data story, and you have a lot of problems that come in the distortion process of any kind of empirical research. So we can have biases and distortions in collection, we can have biases and distortions in analysis, but then we start to have this kind of layer that becomes more problematic with the rise of kind of data visualization, data storytelling, which is that the visualization is also distorting. So this is something that The Guardian deals with a lot because The Guardian loves bubbles, and bubbles are a really inaccurate way to visualize size. But they look really pretty and they show emphasis. So The Guardian, sometimes they just skew the stats a little so the bubbles, look right. And then these debates happen between the kind of precision of the visualization and the readability, the likability, the relatability of the visualization, which is based on a completely different set, right, of design principles and kind of psychology user experience than the kinds of rigorous statistics that we may want to shine through in the academy. And so these worlds are kind of still trying to figure each other out at present. And then, of course, the audience. So in the history of visualization, usually visualizations were used for specific communities. So I'm teaching anatomy students, and they need to know where the parts of the body are, so I make a visualization of the parts of the body for the anatomy students. They weren't really ever used on a wide scale until recently for a kind of general public. And so we need a really different kind of legibility or literacy in reading this kind of data visualizations, which is what has led to the kind of template, really ugly kind of icon man, which is thankfully going a little bit out of fashion, but we were in this period where we have like lots of these templates of infographics that all look the same, and that's largely because we've kind of reduced things to the lowest common denominator, and we're starting to see a bit more creativity infused there. And so the audience, this idea that you have to, we're often using very specialized knowledge, but now we're trying to visualize it for a general audience, causes all kinds of distortions, and then this issue of remediation. So when someone takes that piece of your data or that piece of your visualization and now it's going through social media, or they're making a new map of it, layering it with something else, or they're combining it and mashing it up, and that's all great and exciting stuff that we're, as digital scholars, we're like, yes, this is happening, but of course, as rigorous researchers, this is also a cause for concern. And so this is a tension that we kind of live within. So the idea that we were trying to capture, and feedback welcome, is that when you slice into the nice little data store, you actually have this kind of layers of these distortions that are kind of circulating around. So we got a bit smarter in our 2015 mapping. We now use proper codes in like a real spreadsheet like grown-ups, which is great. And we have prettier maps. And importantly here, of course, we still see with Africa, but Europe has become much more red. And of course, this has to do with migrants at the borders, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. And we still have kind of Brazil, but also we've had this is particularly around the kind of post-Ferguson going on in the US. We have a bit stronger in the US too. So prettier maps, real spreadsheets like grown-ups. And we also started to code for issue data, so like what the protest was about, as well as for location data. So where was the tear gas being fired? Was it in the street where it's supposed to be used, technically? Or was it in, say, a school or a hospital or a vehicle? Because these things are also quite common. And this is just from the other day on the Macedonian border. And we've been thinking about this sort of in line, really inspired by the project, the forensic architecture project at Goldsmiths and conversations that we've had with Yale, and thinking about what we can do when we start to think sort of forensically about what is in these media images that we are capturing. And so we're going to get toxological, I can't even say it right, for a moment. Probably also, if there's any chemists in the room, I apologize now for whatever I mess up here. I'm learning. So this is actually for air pollution, this ugly diagram. We are in the process of revisualizing this for tear gas. But we need to know how much of the pollutant, the toxin, is released, how far away the person is from the release of the toxin, the wind speed, which gives us the dispersion rate, and the concentration then at the site in which the person receives it. And we want to know that for tear gas because, also in the process of revisualizing all of these things, the fatal point of tear gas is way over here. Like in reality, this would be like in the next classroom, of 6,000 milligrams per meter squared, which will kill you. Soldiers get tested at 10, so we're willing to do 10 on humans as a trial basis, but that's kind of the limit that any human should be exposed to. 4 is what is supposed to be used if you're using the weapon properly. And then at 0.5, it's unpleasant, and at 0.004, it's imperceptible. But the problem with this is that if we are inside, say, a very small car or a station, we can be getting, and not 1 cartridge is used, but 2 or 3 cartridges are used, all of a sudden, at 1,000 milligrams per meter squared at release, we could actually be enclosed in a space that has our near fatal dose, or at times our fatal dose. If there's lots of cartridges or larger cartridges that are being used, or if there's any other, this is also the measure of where the actual toxin's killing you, rather than where you're, say, dying from asphyxiation, which can happen when if you panic or you have other kinds of reactions, which are not counted in the mostly military-sponsored clinical trials that are done that determine all of these kinds of medical things. So if we know where the canisters are fired, what obstructions there are, so you can't see too well here, but there's kind of a razor-wired fence, border fence in the background, and then we have residential buildings along the side here, and then all kinds of dangerous things that we should not be running, particularly if we have children, should not be running on, and then we're tear gassing people. So if we know this, I mean, we know just from the scene that this is against UN regulation, but we can actually start to try and calculate or roughly calculate in a kind of citizen science way what is happening in this scene as a kind of evidence of the lethality of the situation, of the danger of the situation. And so we've started a project called Riot ID, which we are calling a Civic Forensics project that uses mainstream and social media in order to try and help empower people to understand what these weapons are and how they're working on them. And so the inspiration for this project came largely from citizen journalists and activists in Taher who were doing lots and lots of collecting and photo documenting and early attempts to kind of ID the weapons that were being used there. And so this is an early kind of WordPress blog that was running in 2011, 2012, where they were trying to figure out how do you do this? How do I understand where this stuff is coming from? And so trying to collect the canisters and then read the canisters and figure out what they mean. And so John Horn, one of my other collaborators, and I have been kind of following all this and kind of thinking about all this stuff for the last few years together. And when Ferguson happened in the US, we started working with a couple journalists there to try, and the Omega Research Foundation, to try and do a more kind of systematic monitoring of the weaponry that was being used in Ferguson in the US. And so we were just looking at this there. So they would send us photos that came from people on the ground there, and we would help them kind of fill out this sort of identification process. And then a little while after this, I was at the Omega Research Foundation's archives, flipping through an old riot control manual, as you do if you're in my line of work, and I stumbled upon this guide for reading new product labels that Defense Technology had produced for their clients because they were changing their branding because they'd been bought by another company, and they wanted to make sure everybody knew, what was inside their products. And so it occurred to me that they were giving us these lovely, legible pictograms, and like, well, why don't we just do what they did, but for people, for regular people to understand what they wanted. And so that evening, serendipitously, after I found this manual, I ended up in the pub after a book launch with a guy who runs a graphic design company that's committed to like eco, social justice, sustainable design stuff. And I was like, hey, we got a few grand left on a budget that we have to spend by the end of July. The honest approach. Do you want to make us? So do you want to do this project with us? I've got this idea. We'd turn this stuff into, and they said yes. And so Riot ID was born out of this. And so the first run, this is the first iteration of the project. And of course, what we're doing is on the scale of the funding and time that we have. So we have lots of great ideas. This is one first piece, an attempt to kind of build an iconography around this idea of identifying riot control weapons. And so kind of the main bit of the Riot ID guide is about how to safely take photos and upload photos, as well as what it is that we need you to record. So these kinds of things about the surrounding area and getting that kind of scene. And then also like that you need to turn the canister on all sides to get all the information, and ideally the top and the bottom of it. And we did this we brought a bunch of weapons IDing experts on the social justice side of things in a room with our designer, and we went through lots and lots and lots of bad civilian photos, citizen journalism and mainstream journalism photos, and we documented all the things that were wrong with them and what would have to be fixed. And then that's how we came up with this kind of first part of the design about, okay, how do we break down the actual process of what you need to do to be able to do this? And so here, just using a lot of kind of infrastructural, instructional design technique and basic kind of iconography here. And then the other thing, then we're like, okay, but how do we get people to like figure out what it is that they're looking at? And so here we did a kind of stripped down version. So we looked at dozens of pictures of canisters and weapons and said, okay, if you strip these down to their barest essential pieces, what do you have left? And then the designer's idea to do a kind of tree diagram so that we're following around this. And subsequently, we've done some research on different kinds of diagram types. And it turns out that tree diagrams are very useful when you are trying to instruct people about sequential flows of things that are unfamiliar to them, which would be good support for this kind of thing. So that is the project, and I'll show you how it works. So this is one of the first times that we used it. We weren't actually fully launched at this stage. And in St. Louis, in the US, there was yet another protest against yet another killing of an unarmed black man by the police. And people that were on the ground, citizen journalism, civilians with iPhones, whatever we want to call them, were tweeting in pictures. And we start to see the pictures and engage in a conversation with them about what it is that they're seeing, ask for different kinds of photos so that we would be able to do the IDs, have this back and forth. And you start to kind of get a kind of conversation going. And here Joel says he's just looking at them too. And aren't these supposed to be used to break through windows and doors? Isn't shooting it at a crowd dangerous and reckless? And indeed it is, particularly if you shoot this grenade, which is a 330 inert barricade projectile, which, as the product specification sheets clearly show, in both this large warning label as well as in its caution sign, that these munitions are designed for specific tactical situations. You have to be trained specifically in deploying them, and you have to exercise extreme care and caution to minimize the possibility of striking a human on the other side of a barrier. So these are for hostage situations. These are for, like, I am an armed, masked gunman with hostages, and you need your SWAT team needs to, like, break into my house. So that's what this is for. This is where they were being used, and these are the people that they were being used on. And so we start to be able to kind of unravel these chains of accountability and evidence by using this kind of what we're calling this civic forensics, engaging people in the ability to produce a kind of forensic understanding of what's happening in the scene. So more recently, we've been looking at this with the riot control weapons that are being used on the borders against migrants. And so we've done a piece around use in the Cali jungle, which of course is being evicted like now as we speak. And a lot of expired gas is being used there, which is like definitely not what you should be doing. And is all kinds of a fire hazard, and being used in tents and in all these things. So even in like the most like policy neutral way, everything that is happening here is a violation of like everything that's written about how you're supposed to use tear gas, including the things that are written by the companies that sell the tear gas. And then here in Macedonia, doing the same kind of thing. So identifying the scenes and what's being used. And then you can also, so in addition to the kind of weapons, also if they're never supposed to be shot at this angle, so if you know things about that angle of that trajectory, so again, thinking about, back to the air pollution diagram of thinking about where's our wind, where's our launcher, what's the distance. So this is very dangerous because the grenade or canister is more likely to hit someone directly. It's supposed to be launched up so that it falls down. So these kinds of basic things that you can learn how to spot in media images. And so we've just done our first kind of more policy-facing report, kind of pulling together some of this. And the thing that I find quite interesting in this, and this is largely, again, I work a lot with geographers in kind of discipline of geography. And so lots of geographers do these kind of citizen science projects where they have people in communities monitoring their own water and air pollution. And like, of course, these people, like, they're not trained, they're not experts, and of course they're like making mistakes and doing it wrong. But the point is not to create a data set that is definitive or a data set that is, definitely totally accurate. The point is to create a data set as a means of pressure, as a means of saying, you keep no records, that is not okay. We've tried, we've done our best. This isn't our job, we're not the experts. But here, this is really not right. Like, look what we found, just in an afternoon, look what we found. You need to respond to this. And so you almost enter this kind of data politics where your kind of DIY data gathering, data aggregation is meant to put pressure on to people whose responsibility it actually is to regulate and collect data. And this we've very much seen in the police killing databases that actually started in 2012 as a project of mostly like a guy in his room that was just doing this kind of very basic media recording of incidences. And then later, after Ferguson, that got picked up by The Guardian, and so The Counted, which is what most people know, was done by The Guardian afterwards, largely using this guy's data, updating it and refining it and verifying it and doing all our journalistic checks on it. And now, just a couple weeks ago, Harvard came out and said that police killing was a public epidemic, pointing to the data that had then been gathered by these other things. But at the same time, I also, as part of this research, subscribe to a lot of policing news bulletins. And they have very different discussions there. And so the police, this group called Streetwise, has also been reusing this data because of this thing. Data's open. So data can be adapted and data can be reused. So they have taken information that only they have, so information that is not publicly available that police hold, layered it onto the existing data that has been collected by The Guardian and these other crowdsourced activists, and then tried to prove that a bunch of the claims that are being made in the media about police killings being racist, police killings, the responsibility of the officer, trying to disprove all of these claims. So I think we're also going to be, I think we already are and are going to further be moving into this territory of open data where we are seeing these kinds of claims competing with each other and going to have to kind of figure out how we're going to kind of make sense of that and how we're going to track that as well. So this is the kind of stuff we're thinking about sort of at this phase in the project. We're also doing lots of translations. Greek coming soon, thanks to our lovely volunteer translator. If anyone speaks any other languages that are not on this list, excellent, excellent. And this is, again, a piecemeal thing. So like once we get enough funding, we do a new translation. And then we also have plans in the work, but not funding at the moment. We've had a few failed bids, so we're working, keep going, to do a mobile app, which is a kind of obvious thing that this project would need. So our thought was, we've built the kind of print iconography, and we can then translate that quite easily into a mobile app. So if you know any mobile app developers who want to donate their summer to a little project, also would be welcome. So that's that project. You can find out more about that here. And just to end kind of back in the realm of I don't know, things that make me feel like I'm more a proper academic. I'm going to pull out some takeaways also for people who are like, I don't care about tear gas, I don't know why I came here. We're going to pull this back into media studies and just think a little bit about why I think that this goes beyond tear gas and thinking about Riot ID. So the first is going back to the early point I made, which is that I think it's really important that we expand what we consider to be media objects. And I'm going to be a little mean to our discipline for a moment, but I go to these geography conferences, and we just got the preliminary program for ICA and for the big geography one. And the things that geographers are talking about are like really heavy kind of what's happening in the world. Lots of, the climate change, so the surveillance, the migration, police abuse, prison, social justice is really present, and these debates are really present. And when you go to the communication, especially the ICA, which is probably not the best representation of media communications, it's like you struggle to even find those panels to go to. And I think that it's actually a disciplinary problem, that the limited view that we've taken to what counts as an object of study in our field is actually blinding us to the kinds of interventions and dialogues that we could be having if we were willing to push the boundaries of what it is that we consider to be part of our discipline. And I think that other disciplines have lots and lots and lots to gain from the ways that we ask questions. I think that we're really, really good at asking dynamic questions about communication, and we're really good at letting things be in tension and be conflictual. And I think a lot of other disciplines could really gain from that knowledge. And that's kind of, for me, what this other media thinking is about. I think it's important that atmospheres are rendered visible, whether that atmosphere is the atmosphere of a concert, or there's some excellent work in cultural geography at Royal Holloway around busking and the atmosphere of buskers, which is very media studies-y as well. And just kind of thinking about what role, not letting that air be invisible, not letting the elemental just kind of disappear from our considerations. So in a lot of the work, this more with what we do with protest camps, we look at things like what happens when you are trying to live stream in the rain, or what happens when your Occupy camp is in Anchorage, Alaska, and everything freezes every night, and you've got all this laptop equipment. Like, where does it go? Like, there's none of this is happening, you know, in Anchorage, Alaska. It's being like wrapped in like, you know, things and then shoved places. And so what are all these ways that we actually, you know, get electricity, deal with the weather? So these kinds of things that are not necessarily visible, but are all part of these kinds of media ecologies or media infrastructures that are actually this kind of how the communication and media works, right? With the things we need for it to work. More practical or pragmatically, I think that spatial approaches to media studies can help us analyze and visualize news analysis, can really enliven content analysis. All you need to do to make maps out of your content analysis is put a location in. You don't even need to like put longitude and latitude anymore. You need like a city or a postcode, and you can make the computer do the rest of it for you. It's called batch geocoding. It takes seconds. And it just all of a sudden it gives you this much, not just a different way of reaching public and telling your story, but also a different way of understanding through that kind of visual analysis that you get through mapping. So really easy thing. I think it should be part of what we're teaching, particularly postgrads, and trying to give these kinds of digital methods and skills. And then the thing I'm kind of thinking about the most recently, and kind of the next sort of paper that I'm going to be working on, is thinking about a move from citizen journalism to civic forensics, and thinking about how we can empower people not only to record and bear witness, which has largely been the focus of citizen journalism, but to how we use images to create chains of accountability and evidence. So how we understand the importance of those images that we're taking, and what is actually, how we do this kind of deeper understanding. This is what we're thinking of as a forensic understanding of what's in these images, and training more people in the ability to do that, and thinking about what the significance of that kind of shift is. So thank you for listening and for having me here and for inviting me. Yeah, and I'm excited to talk some more, hear your questions, thoughts, anything.